All right, at the tail end of the last section, we were talking about intellectual property views as a definition for privacy, meaning essentially from a legal standpoint that you would own your data in the same way that you could own intellectual property like a poem or something that you'd compose. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems with that in more detail. One thing that's a little problematic about it is that there are lots of different kinds of data that people might have a privacy interest in. Their own identity, for example. You might have a privacy interest in that, even though in some circumstances identity information is necessarily public. For example, voter registration lists. Your financial information, again, you'd probably have a privacy interest in this, but in other circumstances, some of these records have to be public. Obviously, healthcare and biometrics, there are laws on the books to try and protect this sort of stuff, but even for those, there are exceptions that would be useful for the standpoint of research. So, for example, right now with the COVID-19 spreading all over the place, people are kind of interested in suspending some of the healthcare privacy regulations so that we can get a better sense of exactly what works and what doesn't in trying to treat or develop a vaccine for something like the COVID-19 virus. Communications data, a lot of people would consider that sort of thing to be private by default, but we still need call records for billing purposes and for other regulatory purposes that are kind of pre-existing. And then, of course, location data. It's necessary if you want to have a cell phone to be able to give your location up, at least to some extent, so that the phone call can actually reach your phone. But you want to protect your location data in other circumstances. So it's not clear because of this dual nature of the information, where in some cases we have a legitimate use that wouldn't necessarily have privacy implications. And in other circumstances, you might have a strong legitimate privacy interest. It's not clear how a data ownership approach to privacy would work in this kind of an environment. Another problem is actually the data elements themselves. If you think about the 5 definitions that we have here related to how you might think of the things that compose a data element in which someone may have privacy interest, it's not obviously clear that a single model is going to work for all of them. So let's go through the definitions, and then I'll talk a little bit about how ownership kind of fails in light of these definitions and how they work together. The first 2 we want to consider are the subject and the owner. So the subject would be the person who's being described by the data. So for example, if I had healthcare data, it would be the patient, right? The person who's actually suffering from whatever it is or subject to whatever it is that we're talking about. The owner would be the person who is legally in possession of the data. And this is where the first piece of this ownership model breaks down. If you own your own healthcare data, then how does a entity like an electronic health records provider or even your doctor get access to it? Typically, these models assume that you have some sort of licensing agreement or bailment agreement where the third party or the first party with whom you're doing business would be allowed to have access under certain terms and conditions. But that access, is, in an intellectual property perspective, is the same thing as ownership. And so it's very difficult for disputes involving this sort of thing, this type of ownership, to be easily resolved. And because of that, that legal model doesn't particularly work well. Other considerations: purpose, provenance, and retention policy. So the purpose is the original purpose for which the data was provided. This is most relevant from a contextual integrity standpoint, but if you're thinking about ownership, there is no way, other than like having hundreds of contracts with everybody you might have access to your data or might need ownership over your data for the purpose of processing, to manage purpose. So in a intellectual property arrangement, you would have contractual obligations under certain circumstances to protect the data or to do things with it, like remove it from a website, that sort of thing. And this is problematic from a privacy standpoint because there are so many different purposes that you might want to put some very basic data about yourself to, that you'd have to have a huge network of contracts with all of the people who might need access to something like your billing information or your credit card information. That would be somewhat problematic. All right, provenance is where the data came from, so who's actually creating the record in the first place. This would be something like AT&T creating your cell phone records or Verizon creating your cell phone records. Because they are the originator of the record, they're creating it, they may have some inherent ownership right over the process of how that record is created. And this is going to be difficult to reconcile with a pure intellectual property style approach to to privacy. And then, of course, the retention policy. How long can the data be kept? This is problematic in the sense that some people would actually prefer for cloud providers to just hold on to their data forever. A good example of this would be like email. Most people expect a Gmail to just hang on to whatever emails they've had for as long as the owner of the owner of the account wants it to be held onto. That's a little bit problematic for a variety of reasons. Gmail could be bought. The company is doing really well right now, but who knows what happens 15, 20 years from now. Maybe Microsoft wants to buy Google, or just maybe that intellectual property from Google. Does the retention policy have to carry over, or could Microsoft just unilaterally say, we're deleting everything? Another good example that would be a little bit problematic from a retention standpoint is if the owner wants to delete something that actually involves multiple parties. So if you're thinking about a Facebook post that many people have commented on, does the person who originally posted it have the right to delete all of the comments as well as the post in and of itself? Or should there just be like a blank entry and then everybody else who's commented would have their comments sort of floating off of that blank entry? It's not immediately clear how retention policies work when you have multiple owners who are sort of entangled in a way that's irreconcilable. So a little bit problematic from an ownership model as well. And then finally, there are information privacy problems that are related to ownership and data. Good example here, data collection. We may be able to hold and manipulate huge numbers of records, and those records themselves could have information in the aggregate that would be useful. So what happens to the individual privacy interest of a particular record when the aggregate that is being collected, the aggregate piece of the collection, is actually the valuable piece? Another way of thinking about this is with machine learning models. So if you're trying to build a image recognition algorithm for faces or for animals or something like that, the owner of individual images in the database might have a privacy interest in their own face or their pet or something like that, but they wouldn't necessarily have a privacy interest in the machine learning model that is generated based on that, at least under current law. The problem is, should they? Is that something that we should actually have some ownership requirement for? Like, should I own a little tiny piece of a facial recognition algorithm that was built using some images of me and my family? Maybe. Hard to say. Notice and consent is another information privacy issue. If there is a collection and it's providing consent to the owners of records that are found in the collection, it may actually be impossible at some point over time to know what's being collected and by whom, and whether or not there has been consent provided. So a good example of this would be, again, going back to machine learning. If you're just scraping a whole bunch of images off of the raw internet, maybe not off of a site like Facebook where everything is sort of centralized, but just crawling the internet and finding images that look like faces and using that for a facial recognition algorithm. The collection process here doesn't really involve consent, doesn't allow for consent, and it's very difficult in an environment like we have now, with notice and consent being the foundation that the Federal Trade Commission uses, and most European regulations are sort of based on the same sort of notice and consent model, including the GDPR. It's very difficult to reconcile that with the actual practice of the raw internet, where everything is sort of available and semi-public in ways that are kind of problematic for privacy. And then the third information privacy problem, especially one that deals with ownership, is control and ownership of data. Once the user provides consent to the data is actually like materially out of the user's control, and because of that, so is ownership in a way. It may not be possible for the user to know whether or not the actual controller of data has actually deleted everything. So if I tell Facebook, yeah, you got to delete all my records, what would I get from Facebook that would prove they've actually deleted all of my records? This is problematic with the GDPR once again because of the right to be forgotten, which is built into the GDPR. In the European Union, if you have a record that's available on a website, you can request that website delete that record, or at least not link to it. And that's very, very difficult to implement in sort of like the internet at large. All right, so that's this little section on data and ownership, and next we'll talk a little bit about the legal history of privacy and technology.